Yes, I've got her back, and she should be one of the very few people that everybody that wants to know more about Mike Johnson and his journey should be reaching out to. Sarah Posner, welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me again, Pete. It's good to see you.
Yes, you met the new Prince, Speaker of the House, who takes his orders, I think, from the King Donald. We can talk about that.
No, I think he takes his orders from another king, but okay. The King of Kings.
Well, I mean, you're the one that would be able to split that hair if there is a way to split it. But you, because you cover the Christian right and have for a long time, interviewed Mike Johnson way back in 2007 when he worked for an organization called Alliance Defense Fund, which every American should know everything about. Go ahead. Tell me about meeting him and what he was up to.
So at the time, it was called Alliance Defense Fund. It is now called Alliance Defending Freedom. And it's basically the Christian rights answer to the ACLU, except the people whose rights the Alliance Defending Freedom believes are under attack are conservative Christians who oppose abortion rights, church-state separation, and LGBTQ rights. I think today they probably have, an annual budget close to $100 million. When I did a big piece on them in 2017, they had an annual budget of $80 million. And staff attorneys and an army of allied attorneys who do pro bono work for them across the country. And so in 2007, I was doing a story on how the Alliance Defense Fund had a plan to eviscerate the separation of church and state, at the Supreme Court.
Right.
And, I interviewed Johnson. He was a lawyer for the Alliance Defense Fund. He also kind of did their public facing, he was the one who gave interviews to journalists and did a lot of their public facing stuff. And he talked to me about, just basically their goal of getting rid of, the guardrails between church and state that exist in the Constitution and were held up by the Supreme Court until more recently the right-wing court began, chipping away at it, and it's almost gone. And that has a lot to do with the work that Alliance Defending Freedom has done at the Supreme Court for many decades. They're definitely playing a long game. But he talked to me about how basically, they believed, they contended that, in the name of church-state separation, the viewpoint of Christians was being discriminated against. So because of church-state separation, they claimed Christians could not share their faith. They were being silenced. They were being canceled. Although that wasn't the popular word at the time.
Right.
But you see how successful these arguments have been in some of the more recent cases that the Supreme Court has decided, like the case involving the football coach who prayed on the football field, the case involving the baker who refused to bake a cake for a same-sex couple's wedding. That was an Alliance Defending Freedom case. And Mike Johnson, by that time, which was 10 years after I first met him, when I wrote the piece then about Alliance Defending Freedom, 10 years later, Mike Johnson was in Congress, and he had helped write an amicus brief signed by several members of Congress in favor of the baker's position in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And his trajectory from having been Alliance Defending Freedom lawyer, litigating against same-sex marriage, litigating against church-state separation, litigating against abortion, between then and the time I met him again 10 years later, he had become the founding dean of a failed Christian law school. He had his own firm called Freedom Guard, and he had served in the Louisiana legislature for a very brief time, and then he ran for Congress. And so he had a pretty rapid ascent to Congress, and now a really rapid ascent. I mean, he was first elected to Congress in 2016, and now 7 years later, he's speaker. It's like really kind of amazing. But this is what the Christian right more broadly, and specifically here, ADF, want from their lawyers. They want their lawyers to not just first be, a lawyer for them, representing their clients in cases like, involving abortion, same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, all the rest, church-state separation, religious freedom. But they want them, they don't want to just stay there. They want them to become members of Congress. They want them to become judges. They want them to become state attorneys general. And a lot of them have done that, and I
Yeah.
think that Mike Johnson, is perhaps their greatest success story.
I'm not sure how much they had to do with the Supreme Court choices of Donald Trump. I mean, you think of the Heritage Fund or the Federalists on most of them, but if he is their crown jewel, so be it. That's the goal. This organization and this wider movement, which is much more than this organization, the fact that he is now the Speaker of the House is a really terrifying and sad inflection point, which basically I think gives great credit to the work of you, a handful of other journalists and scholars who I will take a little credit in reading and interviewing over the years, because what you have been covering was considered, you can change the words, but more fringe for political reporters. It was a little bit more controversial and so on. But what it leads to today is a real blindsidedness or ignorance amongst media, amongst even respectable journalists, about where they have always been going, They are there. They have arrived. And now this guy is the Speaker of the House. You wrote on Blue Sky, people are now going to start digging more into Johnson's past, are going to start listening to his dozens of podcasts, past writings, etc. Let me just predict that, as shocking as a lot of that content will be to most people, it's absolutely commonplace among white evangelicals. You know that because you've been covering it. So maybe tout your work and why it matters so much, because what you've been saying, we've arrived, Sarah. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that political reporters, inside the Beltway reporters who spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, or a lot of time on the campaign trail with presidential candidates, they're a bit in a bubble, even though the Republican candidates are not shy about, talking about, praying, talking about their biblical worldview, talking about their positions on various issues. Political reporters tend to see those issues either as kind of secondary, or the religious talk that some candidates might engage in on the campaign trail as merely a play to the base, right? Not really something that they actually believe themselves. It's just you know, it's just their way of reaching out to the base. And so I think that they miss that this is actually really, no, they are true believers. This is not just a play for the base. They came from the base. I mean, a lot of the younger members of Congress, or people who are in state legislatures now, they did not come out of, some kind of, strictly political training recruitment drive. They came from the religious rights recruitment drive. And today the religious right is, just like they did in the 80s, recruiting people to run for school boards, and then you start with a school board. Who started at the school board before becoming a member of Congress and a presidential candidate? Michelle Bachmann. None of that has changed. But I think that a lot of political reporters just cannot grasp that, they either think that somebody like Michelle Bachmann is too crazy to be really taken seriously in politics, but she's taken quite seriously by the Christian right. Now she is the dean of the School of Government at Regent University, which was founded by Pat Robertson, right?
What's her husband up to?
That sounds crazy to us, doesn't it?
But go ahead.
But it just shows that she's seen as a serious figure on the Christian right. And so I think that political reporters and editors tended to see religion as this side issue, right? Back in the day when I would try to pitch a story about the religious right in the context of a political campaign, a lot of times I'd have editors say to me, "Well, we just did a religion story last month, right?" And like, well, you wouldn't say we just did a politics story last month, right? And so it's just like that. And so I think they underestimated just how much the religious right steers the direction of the Republican Party and just how much top Republicans are, like I said, like Mike Johnson, true believers. Maybe somebody like Matt Gaetz or Kevin McCarthy, they don't really fit that mold. And I think that the political reporters didn't take seriously the prospect that someone like Mike Johnson was going to be the one to rise to the top there, because Kevin McCarthy and Matt Gaetz and um, Jim Jordan, who, is also one of them. He's also an evangelical. Uh, I think, but I think a lot of political reporters underestimated how appealing Johnson would be, precisely because he's more like that sort of classic evangelical politician, as opposed to this, mover and shaker on the Hill. I
I
mean, that turned him into a mover and shaker on the Hill, but not in a way that political reporters could predict.
Political reporters really miss this. And I think the reason why they miss this is because they don't seem to understand that, certainly on the right, politics is informed by your Christian nationalism in not a small way anymore. If it was always the most dangerous threat, and they still aren't taking it seriously. There are a lot of religious people in Congress, a lot of Christians, there are a lot of Jews, there are a couple of Muslim people, but they are not using their religion to take our rights or to get elected. And they don't have these giant organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars in the name of their religion behind them. And like, there can be no comparison with these Republican Christian right evangelicals. And it's sometimes hard to categorize them. But we thought Michelle Bachmann was crazy because she talked a lot about her religion, and because we're sexists. We don't think this guy's as crazy because we haven't heard as much about him, and because he's a straight looking white jawed man. He looks like an action figure of a politician. But Sarah, he believes crazy shit. Tell us some of it.
Well, I'm trying to think of the direct quote that I put in the piece that I did at MSNBC. I mean, he says things like, he just said this a few months ago. This is not digging deep into his past history. He said that the rights of parents to get gender affirming care for their kids should be taken away because parents don't have the right to abuse their children.
No parent has a constitutional right to injure their children.
Right.
Looking at the piece now. Yeah.
I mean, that also is a very commonplace view in the religious right, that getting gender affirming care for your child is child abuse. I mean, they've tried to pass legislation that says it's child abuse. He thinks that, marriage equality is against God's design for the family. Abortion should be banned under all circumstances.
He's written 3 bills
Mm-hmm.
for a national ban on abortion. So when my Republican congressman in the Biden district, just north of New York City, Mike Lawler, votes for this guy, Mike Johnson, people might be confused that since we're New York, we're not going to have an abortion ban. No, he just supported a guy who would bring a national ban, is my understanding. That's what he wants.
I think, again, that people do not take that kind of threat seriously. I think that a lot of Republicans are the reason why you hear a lot about the 15-week national ban is they're trying to make it seem like it's not as bad as some of the state bans that are 6 weeks. But it's still a national ban. They came up with this arbitrary random number, right? And the idea that the state, the states' rights party is going to take away people's rights in the states by imposing, a ban. Now, what are the chances of it actually passing and getting through the Senate, which is controlled by the Democrats, right? I mean, those are all a lot of ifs, but those ifs can change. the Republicans could maintain control of the House and regain control of the Senate, right? Trump could, become president again in 2024. I mean, there are a lot of ifs here. And so you have to take seriously when they say, we would like a national abortion ban, and not dismiss it as, oh, well, like that's not really going to happen. When it comes right down to it, they're not really going to do it, or they'd be afraid that they're going to lose elections because there'd be a backlash against it. I mean, like, those are all contingent things. We should be opposed to people who are for a national abortion ban and take them seriously when they say that's what they want to do. They're not making it up. They're not kidding.
No, they are actually doing it. They're passing these laws. I mean, part of the story of America during our lifetime seems to be hard-fought rights won through bloodshed and protest and generational fight, to now seeing many of those hard-fought rights lost. And these are the people that are taking them.
Right.
They're taking them. He
And
wants
I think another important thing to understand, because you brought up abortion, I think a lot of people didn't think the Supreme Court would ever overturn Roe. Yeah, but they did. And they did because the Christian right and the Republican Party worked for decades to not only chip away abortion rights in the states, but to stack the Supreme Court with justices who would overturn it. One of those justices is Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett also has a relationship with Alliance Defending Freedom.
Yeah.
She spoke at their training ground.
She didn't know there were when she took that gig.
Yeah, she didn't know. That was can the sarcasm alert be like plugged
Yeah,
into
I think they heard it in my voice first.
But I think another thing that's really important to understand about Johnson, and this ideology that he shares with the Christian right and that he has advanced on the Christian right's behalf, is that LGBTQ rights, and in particular marriage equality, are necessarily at odds with the rights of Christians and actually infringe on the rights of Christians. So when he was in the Louisiana legislature in 2015, in the months before Obergefell came down, he introduced a bill to give Christians the right to refuse service to same-sex couples or refuse service to people on the basis of their sexual orientation, if it was based on their moral conviction or a sincerely held religious belief. The bill did not even make it through the Louisiana legislature. That's how extreme it was. And the business community and tourism interests in Louisiana were freaking out about it because it was pretty toxic when you think about it, right? They didn't want Louisiana to be a state where people didn't want to have their conventions and so on. That's the kind of legislation he advanced as a state legislature in Louisiana. And that's very much the point of view that he reflected to me when I interviewed him those 10 years apart about his views on church-state separation and LGBTQ rights.
He also voted to block, when he was in that state legislature, apparently New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, from giving healthcare benefits to the partners of gay employees. So he's totally against marriage equality. So he wants to take that right, hard-fought right, away from people. And he also doesn't even not only can you not get married, you can't get the benefits, healthcare benefits, which is so, I don't use the word evil, but like saying that you can't share your healthcare with, it's just so pernicious for so many reasons.
But I think it's really important to understand how akin efforts like that are to efforts 10, 20, 30 years ago to restrict access to abortion. They're thinking about this in the same way. They're thinking, we're not going to overturn Obergefell tomorrow. But in the meantime, we'll make things very difficult for same-sex couples. We'll make things very difficult for LGBTQ people. Trans kids won't be able to get their gender-affirming care. They won't be able to play sports. Same-sex couples won't be able to share healthcare benefits, as you mentioned. These are all things, if you think about them in the same way that you might have thought about 10, 20 years ago, trap laws regarding abortion or different ways that they restricted people's access to abortion. These are steps along the way to their plan to eventually overturn Obergefell. This is not, and people like I said, up until the moment that the Supreme Court overturned Roe, there were a lot of people out there who did not believe that they would actually do it, but they did. And so that's why I want people to take very seriously when people like Mike Johnson talk about religious freedom and the conflict between their religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, that this is the path that they're on
Yeah.
and this is the path that they intend. And even if it doesn't happen in Mike Johnson's lifetime, it's something that he thinks is very important to lay the
Well, they
groundwork for.
believe for sure this is a multi-generational fight, which is part of the problem, I think, in progressive world. We sometimes don't see things as much that way, but for another podcast, I think, okay, so I'm not worried about abortion. I don't care about that. I don't care about gay people. But I do care about contraception. Do I have anything to worry about there? And,
Um,
the point being, like, a lot of people don't care about this stuff, anything, until it affects them. Well, I wonder how people are going to think about the fact that you're not allowed. Well, you can take it from there on contraception and where they want to go there.
okay. So just to be clear, I have not seen anything that Mike Johnson has read or written on contraception. However, um, uh, dissenting far right justices on the court, Thomas in particular, have strongly hinted that because they overturned Roe, the logic of overturning Roe also would require them to potentially overturn Griswold versus Connecticut, which was a case that was decided several years before Roe, but helped lay the legal groundwork for it. And that was a case where the Supreme Court overturned um, criminal laws that prevented even married couples from buying contraception. So the idea that they would overturn Griswold and make it possible for states to enact laws that would criminalize buying contraception is super shocking, like to think about, right? However, it is something that a fairly significant segment of the religious right thinks is something that's worth doing because they just believe that the entire structure of privacy rights under Griswold and Roe is wrong. They also, similarly, I think they would like to see Lawrence versus Texas overturned, and Obergefell. This entire line of cases which made it unconstitutional for the state to interfere with basically, your sexual and reproductive life. They would like to get rid of all of that. They would like
Lawrence
to
v.
make
Texas.
it more invasive of those things. And
Lawrence,
I think that also when you see the zeal that they have for the bans on gender affirming care for trans kids, this is more evidence that they have this zeal for interfering in people's personal, medical, sexual, and reproductive lives.
Lawrence, Texas. Texas. I had to remind myself. Decision. The U.S. Supreme Court. The court ruled most sanctions of criminal punishment for consensual adult. It's about sodomy. They said commonly referred to are unconstitutional. You
Right.
can't make a law against sodomy.
Right. Until extremely recently, there were laws on the books in some states which criminalized sodomy, what they called sodomy. And the Supreme Court held that those were unconstitutional. I think there are a lot of people on the religious right who would like to see those laws come back.
A lot of people on the religious right need to experiment with ass play, is my suggestion. But listen, what am I? Who am I? Sorry, I didn't mean to make you blush, Sarah. But I'm telling you, life changer, guys. So the end here of at least your MSNBC piece is really eloquent. I'll just summarize it. But you say in her nominating speech, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik invoked a biblical story of God commanding Samuel to anoint David king, and you go on, you just talk about what this means here, and you say that between the Bible talk and Johnson's record, Republicans have made abundantly clear they have emerged from the uncertainty and chaos of the last few weeks with one clear mission: to run a Christian nationalist house. And I think if that is as true as it would seem, it's such an important conclusion and point. But I want to leave open for the fact that maybe they didn't know who this guy was
No,
yesterday.
no.
Not a chance. They knew Mike Johnson almost as well as you know Mike Johnson.
Okay, if they don't know Mike Johnson, I mean, obviously, a lot of people do not know all 435
I mean,
members
the
of
reason I
Congress.
ask is
But don't
specifically
the 435 members of Congress, or at least all the members of the Republican caucus, know all the other members of the Republican caucus? How hard is it? Like, I knew everybody in my high school class, and it was bigger than the Republican caucus.
I wonder who you were in high school. But no, but I mean, the reason I asked is very specific in that if they have the majority by such a slim measure, some people were, some snarky social media posts yesterday were this is the vote. Mike Lawler, a Republican in New York, that Mike Lawler lost his seat back to Mondaire Jones, our former congressman. Like, people are making the point that voting for Mike Johnson, and now everybody finding out that how much of a Christian nationalist, fundamentalist, Christo-fascist he is, these guys are going to maybe lose their seat as a result of that. I feel like I'm still trying to be optimistic about the outcome of this guy becoming speaker. They lose the majority.
I mean, that could definitely happen. But the fact that he was such a vociferous election denier um, makes that a little disconcerting.
Yeah, he
Um,
doesn't.
but uh, I think there was another piece I wrote for MSNBC earlier in the week before Johnson was elected speaker, and I was taking a look at the most recent Public Religion Research Institute American Values Survey. And one thing that stood out to me, and I think it's something that people should really, really, really pay attention to, is the enthusiasm. And so the white evangelicals are the most, ardent supporters of Trump, ardent supporters of the stolen election lie, and they are the most reliable voters. Something like 78% of white evangelicals told pollsters that they are certain that they're going to vote in the 2024 election. And you compare that to other demographic groups, they are at the top. They are at the very, very top compared to other Christians, compared to non-religious people, compared to groups broken out by age or other demographics.
Wow.
And so if you don't want to see them in power, you need to vote too.
Yeah, it's a really, really very important point. I'm just sitting here thinking, well, what can they get done? The Republicans have the House, Democrats have the White House and the Senate, obviously,
Mhm.
and so what's there to worry about? But what there is to worry about is more than anything is the trajectory. The fact that this guy is now the Speaker of the House is so, so important. And I think this discussion is hopefully symbolic of why it's so important. Before I let you go, I want to ask you one more question about one more piece you had. A link to all of Sarah's stuff in the show notes for today's episode. But this one is about Christian support for Israel. You've been writing and thinking a lot about this, obviously, the dispiriting truth about why evangelical Christians support Israel. Take as much time as you want to just explain this, but everybody should go read it, because I tried to explain this to one of my daughters, my 18-year-old, the other day, and I just got real lost and looked like a jackass. You know what?
So
I don't know. They all want to end up there. They all have a claim to it, but they all something about the apocalypse. I don't know.
right. So evangelical Christians who are Christian Zionists, which is pretty much all of them, uh, they say that God commands them to love Israel. And that God will bless anyone or any country that blesses Israel and curse any country that curses Israel. So they contend that the United States needs to support Israel no matter what, no matter how far right Israel's government is, or what uh, war crimes and
They could nuke
violations of
Syria.
civil rights Israel engages in Gaza or the West Bank. They support the settlements, they support the occupation, etc. So they make it seem like it's just, we're just on Israel's side. But when you dig down deeper into why they're on Israel's side, so like right-wing Israelis who embrace the support of American evangelicals, they like to say, well, they're on our side. See, they support everything we're doing. And so they're our best friends. But their theology is that they love Israel because it's where Jesus is coming back. And so when the end times begin, or they would say we're actually living in the end times, but very, very soon, there's going to be a series of events that they claim are prophesied in the Bible. So they claim it's all laid out in the Bible, and this is kind of like God's blueprint for what's going to happen. And there's going to be the rapture, and all the believers, all the Christians are going to be raptured to heaven, and they'll avoid all of this terrible stuff that's going on here on planet Earth. And non-believers will have to like undergo this tribulation period, wars and terrible things happening. Eventually, there will be this war to end all wars, and Jesus will return at Armageddon, the Mount of Megiddo in Israel, and he will vanquish these armies that have come from, China or Russia or wherever, that are led by the Antichrist or a false prophet. And at the end of that, the only people who will be left are people who converted to Christianity, and that's it, right? So, Jews, Muslims, they'll have to convert to Christianity, or they'll perish in this final war. And when the final war is over at the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus will sit on a throne on the Temple Mount and rule the world for 1,000 years. And so on the one hand, they try to make it seem like it's about policy, politics, etc., but it's really about these Bible prophecies and their really literal true belief that Jesus is going to come back and win this bloody war and then rule the world. And, John Hagee, who is the founder of Christians United for Israel, which is one of the biggest organizations promoting evangelical support for Israel, he claims to have really, he claims to have convinced Trump, when he was president, to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that, to these evangelical Christians, was another prophetic sign that all the pieces are falling into place.
Wow, I did not know that detail. I'm looking at it right now in your piece. And even if he didn't convince him, the fact that he's smart enough to take credit for it, or that the movement can think that's why it happened, is the only thing that matters. Do these people who believe this about Israel, these white evangelical Christians, I guess they're probably mostly white that believe that, maybe not entirely, but did they get all fired up, and does the hair stand up on there when the violence begins? Because that means it's beginning. Is that like, are they watching it even closer right now? Like, here comes Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Huh. They see it as, every time there's convulsions in the Middle East, they start to talk about, well, maybe this is a sign. I mean, they'll say things like, we know we're living in the end times, but like, are we getting closer? Is this a sign that we're getting closer?
Interesting, fascinating, important, as is all of your work. Boy, do I appreciate you joining me today. Sarah, thank you so, so much. Let's not let it be so long since we talk. I appreciate learning from you.
Thanks, Pete.